Look, I'll talk about another topic when you watch another topic. Isekais! Who doesn't love isekais? Okay, some people don't love isekais, and yes, the isekai genre might be a little oversaturated and maybe a little overhyped, and I'm definitely not helping. I read a lot of Webtoon series, and a worryingly large amount of them are from the isekai genre. For those blissfully unaware, allow me to ruin that bliss. Isekais are a fantasy genre with a twist. The premise of an isekai and its many different variations is basically the equivalent of a fish out of water story, but to the extreme. The standard isekais focus on one person from a normal human everyday world, usually dying and then getting dropped off into a fantasy world. The reverse isekai is obviously the reverse, but not quite. It takes the fantasy elements from a fantasy world and then drops them off into a normal everyday human one. There's also a subgenre of reverse isekais, which is basically the exact opposite of an isekai, which drops not the fantasy elements, but just like an individual from a fantasy into the everyday world. The thing that separates this from just like modern fantasy stories is this idea of suddenly. The individual or the element didn't exist alongside everything until randomly, usually there's like a story or a world reason, but that's besides the point, randomly said individual or the elements just like appear. So yeah, isekais are just like fantasy with some flavor. Honestly, it's typically pretty fun. Action series have kind of taken reverse isekais over thanks to solo leveling. Meanwhile, standard isekais have been interestingly taken over by like romance for like marrying princes and all that fun stuff. But there will always be exceptions to the rule, like my favorite isekai, The Greatest Estate Developer, having some of my favorite character and interactions, focusing on a character's strength without making them wildly strong for next to no reason. But there's another series that in my mind is just as great for some different reasons. The Academy's Undercover Professor. Other than being 3 words that I constantly misspell, the best way I can describe and explain The Academy's Undercover Professor is an isekai that you kind of forget is an isekai, but in like the best way possible. The Academy's Undercover Professor follows... Oh, we don't actually get his name from when he's just a normal human. That's, well, whoever he was, he had a very weird life. Growing up, he was told something very strange by his mom, that he has to become a shaman, because, as she puts it, the gods are watching over you. And if he didn't, a great disaster would strike him down one day, which is a wild thing for a mom to say to her child, but I guess mother knows best. As 10 years later, when he's finally an adult with a job, finally taking his first steps into society, he dies, but is reincarnated into a fantasy world. A more steampunk world with magic and knights and all that fun stuff. We're introduced to our main character, Ludgar Cherish, a fallen noble who's going to teach at the Korin Academy, a wildly prestigious magical academy. On the train headed to said academy, he talks to a nice old man named Gerard, when the train gets taken over by terrorists. And in an act to get information out of a terrorist, Ludgar blows up and dies? Wait, he already died though. That can't... does he get isekai again? Well, turns out, no, Ludgar is dead. But the twist isn't that he's not dead. I mean, probably. But instead that Ludgar, the fallen noble who's gonna be the professor, isn't the main character. Because as Ludgar is blown up, the mask is pulled off, quite literally, as Gerard's face is damaged, revealing our actual main character. Turns out we don't actually know our main character's name. Gerard the old man, Machiavellia the mercenary that ended the war, James Mortarian, a maybe criminal mastermind. We don't know a whole lot about this life. Abraham Van Helsing, a cryptid hunter, which is really cool. Arsène Lupin, apparently a master thief. Whatever our main character's name is, he's lived a lot of lives. And that's kind of the point. He's practically a spy, putting the undercover in Academy's Undercover Professor. Meanwhile, the Academy's Professor part comes from him accidentally assuming the life of Ludgar Cherish. How you accidentally assume someone's life? Well, I'll tell you. While taking care of the terrorist as a mercenary hunter mage, the police accidentally mistake him for Ludgar, and as he's making his escape, someone from the Academy grabs him, thinking that he's Ludgar, and brings him to the Academy. Like, at this point, he's just too far in. He accepts the job, and this is where the series really starts. Lugar, Gerard, Machiavellia, James, Mortarian, I don't know how to say that last one, Abraham Van Helsing, Arsene Lupin, call him whatever you want, I'm just gonna stick with Lugar because it's kind of easy, is our isekai main character. And if you paid attention, that's pretty apparent, just in the identities he goes by. You might have heard of Machiavellia, that's a pretty famous name. James Martyry, I don't know how to say that name, is actually Sherlock Holmes' archenemy. Abraham Van Helsing is a fictional vampire hunter that fights against Dracula. Arsene Lupin is a fictional master thief and is likely, I think, related to Lupin III. In the long run, these names don't actually matter a whole lot. These aliases come up from time to time, Machiavellia and James being the main ones that are brought up. But the reason I bring up the names is because of what they represent. That this series cares. This series cares about the little details, the little things that you might overlook or overthink. I honestly didn't even know that these aliases were taken from fictional stories until I saw Arsene Lupin and thought of the Lupin movie I saw on Hulu. These small little details that can be overlooked by a common reader shows how much the series does with what it has. Now, this series is an isekai. Lugar basically comes from our world. The very little we see of it is very reminiscent to our world, but even if the Academy's undercover professor is by definition an isekai, the series doesn't beat you over the head with it. It uses its premise in very specific and very thoughtful ways. It honestly doesn't even remind you that he's from a different world every other chapter like other series do. Instead, it's through Lugar's ideas that it shows that he's from a different world. I already mentioned the aliases, but there's more. I mentioned he was an undercover mercenary mage. The undercover thing I already explained with the likely 6+ aliases he's had, but the other two are just as cool. The mercenary part is kind of hard to explain, but he's almost like an assassin, using blades, grappling hooks, traps, and stealth to take care of his opponents. But he also uses magic, bringing us to the mage parts. Now, in some other series, our main character would be magically gifted and powerful, talented beyond imagination. Now, technically speaking, Lugar is powerful, but not in the traditional sense. Instead, his magic comes in two forms: magical knowledge and real magic. Real magic is a little tricky to explain. It is very clearly potent magic, but we've only seen it a handful of times and have never gotten an explanation of what it is. But instead, I want to look at magical knowledge. I mentioned that the series uses the isekai premise in specific and thoughtful ways, and that magical knowledge is a prime example of it. Since he's a magical professor, we get a lot of explanation on how magic works very organically, which is great. I love when magic systems are explained. But we also get Ludgar's take on magic. On his first day of classes, he calls out magic for being stagnant. He knows how much science can and will develop as the years go on, while many magical principles have stayed the same. And we see Ludgar attempting to bring a little creativity, bring a little innovation to magic. The first class he has, he shows off a new technique to materialize magic 4 times faster than normal people. A technique he calls the source code, obviously taking inspiration from source code, I assume. I don't know enough about coding to say anything definitively, please don't make fun of me. Later, we see him use a new method to increase elemental power by attaching personal history and memories to make the magic more personal. We also see another technique, the designated coordinate technique, a technique to cast magic at a distance. He also uses magic to create a Klein bottle for experimental purposes. It's very unclear why. Lugar isn't powerful or special because he got isekai'd. He's powerful and special because he took what he knows from the past life and applies it into the fantasy world. Actually, if we're being completely honest, Lugar isn't talented. He's very untalented in terms of the series. For example, he has control over all 10 elements, which might sound good at first, but it's actually kind of a curse. It means he can't master any individual element. It's better to have control over one element than all 10 of them. He also has a condition where he leaks magic just by breathing, and he leaks even more by casting spells. He needs pills to help keep him steady, and if he doesn't, the voices from the void start to leak through. In fact, these voices are very likely the same gods that have been watching over him that his mom kind of weirdly talked about from his past, and we haven't even gotten to Lugar himself. You'd expect him to be this super slick, hardened criminal or mastermind, or a charismatic spy hero with all of his aliases and stuff, but nope. The best way I've seen someone describe him is a competent idiot. I mentioned that he accidentally assumes the life of Ludgar Cherish. It was actually quite easy to fit into that role because Ludgar Cherish was already a spy. The actual Ludgar Cherish was part of the secret criminal organization known as Black Dawn, an organization that he's very high up in, part of the First Order. But he doesn't find this out until it's too late. His first encounter with Black Dawn is him bluffing it out, pretending he's Ludgar but panicking on the inside. My guy is super stressed. The entire series is actually him getting into situations he didn't sign up for, bluffing his way out of problems, remaining cool and calm on the outside, but sweating bullets on the inside. It's honestly my favorite part of Ludgar. He's more than just a really fun character, like in The Return of the Blossoming Blade, but a really relatable one too. And I haven't even mentioned the really cool stuff they do with like the teacher and the professor arc, other characters, the magic system itself. It's just so much fun. The Academy's undercover professor does a lot with the Isekai theme, but even when it does a lot, it doesn't rely on you remembering that Ludgar is from another world. There aren't a lot of teehee, remember he's from the human world things. Instead, it's a lot more of Ludgar's experience from a normal human world being placed into a fantasy world, which is honestly the best. Look, I love fantasy. It's my favorite genre. And a well-done isekai can make me appreciate the fantasy world with modern twists, but sometimes a series can rely on it too much. But this series doesn't. With fun characters, a great magic system, and a good isekai premise that doesn't constantly badger you that it's an isekai, it's a great series. So make sure you check out the Academy's Undercover Professor, updating every week on Webtoon.